All right, so guys, welcome into my full analysis and breakdown of the first official college football playoff rankings that were released on Halloween night last night. And we're just going to go 1 through 25. What are the major takeaways? Was I surprised? Was I not surprised? Let's kick it off at number one. If you know how the committee ranks these teams and how they normally do their initial rankings, you should not be surprised at all that the Buckeyes of Ohio State are sitting at number one. The best resume, 2 top 15 wins. There's really no arguing it now. You can understand the nuance, and, if you look at Vegas, Ohio State, they've got like the third or fourth best odds to win the national title. They're not power ranked as the number one team. But even if you want to try and argue that, ESPN's own power ranking mechanism, ESPN FPI, has Ohio State slightly at number one. So all of that factored in, not surprising that Ohio State is number one. Certainly there are major question marks with the team, but if we were to do a ranking comparison where we combined quality wins, resume, and analytical data, Ohio State is the clear number one. They do have Georgia at number two, so this is where things got a little weird for me. I was very certain they were going to put Florida State at number two because, again, normally early on in these rankings when they release the first few, it's all based on resume. Florida State, obviously, with a much better resume than Georgia at this point. But they do go Georgia at number two. Guys, it's pretty crazy considering Georgia started the season 0-5 against the spread. They really haven't beaten anyone. Now, that's going to change probably with Missouri, but very surprised. And that's a thing where if I was a Florida State fan, I'd be very concerned right now. Because the question with Florida State has always been, we know if they're 12-0 and they lose in the ACC championship, they're done. The only other question was, could they lose before the ACC championship and then win the ACC championship and still make the playoff at 12-1? As a conference champion with a win over LSU. The number one thing that FSU has to do right now, they have to root for LSU to beat Alabama. That win becoming more valuable is so critical to Florida State. It gives them potential wiggle room. If they somehow lose an end of the season, regular season game, it allows them to possibly lose a game there and then still make the playoff. The other thing I want to comment on, people are starting to say, well, Ohio State, even if they lose to Michigan, they're still going to be in. That is not true. Okay, that is how it worked out last year, but Ohio State got a massive break with Utah beating USC. Ohio State, even if they lose to Michigan, they're probably going to be on the outside looking in, even with the quality wins over Penn State and Notre Dame. Now, if you're an Ohio State fan, you need to be rooting for Notre Dame to beat Clemson, because Notre Dame is sitting there only 3-point favorites on the road. If Notre Dame were to lose to Clemson, your resume just got a lot worse. So it's important for, if you're a fan of Ohio State, if you're a fan of FSU, you've got to be rooting for the teams that you have already beaten because it helps your resume. Michigan at number three, they're a very polarizing team with the cheating stuff. They said in the rankings they're not going to talk about the cheating. They're just ranking the teams, how they are. So I'm not really going to get into that in this video, but I will say Michigan, they're blowing everyone out, but they haven't faced anyone. 0 top 30 wins. It is what it is. You're not going to be ranked number one with 0 top 30 wins, although Michigan, they certainly have been dominant. So those are your top four. I thought Florida State would have been number two. Honestly, I thought possibly Washington could have been number three, but, a little bit surprised that Georgia is sitting there at number two. Certainly, you could say recently Georgia crushing Florida, winning some of these games by a lot. Also the fact that if you do want to factor in last year and the year before, they are back-to-back, defending national champions. Maybe the committee did take that into account. Normally they don't. Moving on outside of the top four, you do have Washington at number five. So if I was Washington, it's a concerning ranking here because the question, well, honestly, I think Washington's okay. The problem is Washington is undefeated right now, and they're out on the outside looking in. Right? Imagine if they actually lose a game to USC this week, which I think they might. How far would they go down? Is it a case if you're Washington to where you can suffer one loss towards the end of the regular season? I think they might actually suffer two, honestly, just based off the fact that the Pac-12 is tough. Washington has not been playing well, but if you are Washington, you think you're pretty safe to where, let's say you lose to a USC or an Oregon State, you can just come back and win in the Pac-12 championship against Oregon again and make the playoff as a one-loss Pac-12 champion. You would expect that to be the case, and that's when you start developing arguments of a one-loss Ohio State team who doesn't make their conference championship because they lose to Michigan, and then a Washington team who also has one loss, but they won their conference championship. The other thing that's going to hold Washington back is a horrible non-conference schedule. Their best non-conference game was Michigan State. Michigan State is a complete bottom feeder this year. You do have Oregon at number 6. Oregon is set up very obvious. They have to win out. If they win out, they will be in, probably in the 2v3 game, because that's going to be a really good resume for them, but they need to win out. You do have Texas at number 7. Very simple for Texas. Win out and you're in. You get your rematch with Oklahoma, probably, unless Oklahoma slips up. You're probably going to be facing them in the conference championship. Very obvious, although I think Texas, they're going to have a tough game this week. We might get a real shakeup depending on what happens with Texas and Kansas State, and, Texas dealing with the Quinn Ewers injury. You do have Alabama at number 8. Very simple for Alabama. Well, there is an argument that you could make Alabama could suffer another loss and then win their conference championship and get in as a 2-loss team. I'm not going to say that's going to happen, but for Alabama, win out and you're in. This is a big game against LSU. Like, imagine Alabama beats LSU. That would be like their 5th really good win. Then they lose to someone in the SEC, but they still make the SEC championship, and then they beat an undefeated Georgia. How would you rank that? It's probably not going to happen, but it is interesting. You do have Oklahoma at number 9. That's a tough ranking for Oklahoma, man. It really is. Now, we knew they were going to drop because they lost to Kansas, but at this point for Oklahoma, would I say they're guaranteed in if they win out? I would probably not say that, no. It'll be interesting with Oklahoma. The other thing you have to wonder, imagine Texas actually doesn't make their conference championship game, and it's like Oklahoma State. Well, it wouldn't be Oklahoma State. It's just an interesting thing. The Big 12 championship could get watered down if Texas loses, to where Oklahoma is facing a team in the Big 12 championship that's not a top 10 team. So that's not really a resume builder for Oklahoma, if that makes sense. Ole Miss at number 10 is in a very interesting spot. Ole Miss is very likely not going to make their conference championship, even with one loss right now, because they do have one loss on the year. They have that win over Tulane, but obviously the committee understands that that was without Michael Pratt, Tulane's best player, their starting quarterback. Ole Miss has to hope that Alabama loses to probably LSU and Auburn. Those would be the 2 games Alabama would have to drop. Ole Miss wins out. They go to the SEC championship, and then they beat Georgia, and they're in the playoff. Otherwise, I don't see Ole Miss making it. Also, Ole Miss, I believe, faces Georgia, so this is all probably going to take care of itself. You do have Penn State sitting at number 11. They do have that loss to Ohio State. Penn State is kind of just lurking right now. Their season comes down to the home game against Michigan, the noon game, and that's pretty much all I can say about Penn State. They do have to make sure they beat Maryland on the road, though. That's kind of a sneaky game. They're only 11-point favorites. Missouri at number 12. Their season comes down to this week. They need to beat Georgia. If they beat Georgia, that is a program-changing win. You go from number 12 to very likely top 6, maybe even higher. You're in front of Georgia automatically. Yeah, and if they lose, it's pretty much just same old SEC. They would fall back to number 19 or 20. You do have Louisville at number 13. I don't think Louisville's going anywhere. I understand they have one loss. You do have LSU at number 14, the first 2-loss team. LSU is sitting in a spot. Yes, if they win out, they're probably going to be in, I would guess, but the chances of them winning out with the horrible defense are very slim. Notre Dame sitting at number 15. Notre Dame very likely could win out as long as they beat Clemson, and if they finish the season 10-2 with one of those losses coming to Ohio State, that's probably a top 10 overall ranking at the end of the season there for them, possibly a New Year's Six Bowl. And then you do have Oregon State sitting at number 16, Tennessee at 17. We'll see with Tennessee. All these teams have 2 losses. Utah, a little bit too high for me. I would have Utah lower. I would have UCLA in front of Utah. And then USC at number 20 with no defense. Kansas sitting at 21. Oklahoma State at 22. So that's pretty good if you're Oklahoma, because that shows me the committee values Oklahoma State, putting them ranked inside at the top 22, and then Kansas State at 23. Tulane at 24, and then Air Force, a little bit disrespectful for Air Force. We understand they have a bad schedule, but if you look at strength of record or anything like that, I would say Air Force should be around number 20, and then this is the strength of record metric. This is actually all the metrics combined. You can take a look. Strength of record, Ohio State number 1. FPI, Ohio State number 1. Strength of schedule, Ohio State, 15th toughest schedule. Just take a look at that right column. You can just see Ohio State 1, Florida State 2. That's why I thought Florida State was going to be ranked second, and even Florida State's strength of schedule is at 49. You can see Bama with the 8th toughest schedule in college football so far. I think people are kind of underrating Alabama. Ole Miss sitting with the 10th toughest schedule, but a lot of that is, kind of iffy considering, Tulane didn't have their starting quarterback. And then you can see going all the way down at Georgia, number 7 in terms of strength of record, the 100th toughest schedule. They haven't faced anyone. Michigan all the way down at number 9. How about James Madison? Yeah, I saw people talking about James Madison. Apparently, James Madison cannot be ranked by the committee. That is unfortunate. You do have Missouri down there as well, Oregon, Penn State, LSU, and Louisville. So based on how all this is shaking out, certainly not surprised that Ohio State is number 1. Little bit surprised that they didn't put Florida State at number 2. Normally it's more resume based, at least early on. And Florida State at this point does have a significantly better resume, but they wanted to have some nuance. They wanted to put Georgia at number 2. They have played better recently. Michigan coming in at number 3. They're blowing everyone out, but they just have had such a terrible schedule. And then FSU with Washington, who does have some holes on their team. They are on the outside looking in, kind of the biggest unbeaten in terms of those top 5 teams ranked last. And if I was a Washington fan, I'd be pretty pissed off considering you do have that win over Oregon compared to both Georgia and Michigan. That's a significantly better win. Either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.